Welcome to the Heartification podcast, where I interview people on how art has affected their lives and what it means to them. Art has a very special place in my life. It not only makes me feel happy, but it allows me to make others feel special. This podcast is all about how art has made an impact on others' lives, for all ages, all backgrounds, and all walks of life. You can find more about this podcast guest in my show notes. Without further ado, let's welcome my next guest. He is a speaker, writer, filmmaker, entrepreneur, and life coach. Please welcome my next guest, Philip McKernan.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the first question I always ask is, how do you define art?
I think art is the way in which you can show the world who you really are.
Yeah, I love that. Like, my definition is any way you're able to express yourself and, show people what you're feeling and who you are inside. I love that.
Yeah, a simpler definition for me would be art equals truth. In other words, the art that you produce is often the essence of oneself in terms of who you are and how you're feeling in that moment or that time.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And what art forms are you exposed to?
So, I mean, for the longest time, I create speeches, I create workshops. I would never have considered myself a traditional artist. I would never have seen myself. I would have considered art things like painting or music, more traditional expressions of art. I would never have considered myself in that realm. And I remember taking some time out for myself, like the work I do with others. I did a retreat, and I remember just having this very, very simple epiphany that, you know what, you are an artist, that when you go to create a talk in front of 5,000 people or 5 people, or you create a workshop, there's a form of artistry that's required to express and to put it together, and then creativity to kind of, produce it to some extent. And I realized, and I made a statement that I said, I am an artist. So for me, artistry personally is in the form of creating philosophy, creating quotes, creating, keynotes, workshops, that kind of thing. Also, I read, not a lot, but I read some poetry as well, which I love.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, back to your point where at first you thought art was just, visual arts like painting and music and dance. I used to think that too, but as I thought about it, art is everything. And if we go back to our definition, where art is how you express yourself and how you let all of your emotions, anything can be an art, and everyone is an artist.
Yes, because I believe everybody's an artist. However, not many people get to express their artistry. I would also go a step further, and I would say, based on experience, that many artists, even the ones that we all know about, some of the greatest painters, the greatest poets, the greatest writers, the greatest sports people, have died with some of their greatest music, some of the greatest canvases that had never been produced inside of them. In other words, if art is your truth, sometimes people don't want the world to know their truth, and they shy away from it, and they produce artistically what they think the world wants of them, because we care a lot what people think of us. So my job, amongst other things, is to help people get in touch with the true essence of who they are, and then to begin to express that into the world. And that's a fun project.
Yeah, I love that. And on your website, you mentioned that you are dyslexic. Are there any artistic things that help you with that?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm not going to pick on your question, but it's interesting that it's just the question is interesting to help you with dyslexia, when in actual fact, I have seen dyslexia as individually not a hindrance. I used to see it as a hindrance. I used to see it as something that held me back. I now see it as a wonderful gift, because like anybody who's got any ailment or challenge or disability, if they're open to it, if they don't linger on the disability and be a victim to that disability, and if they're open to looking at outside of, on the peripheral vision, they'll see that actually they've been, something maybe has been taken from them perhaps, or they haven't been gifted in that area, but they are amplified in another area. Having said that, I'm a very visual person. So when I dream and aspire to create things in my life, one thing I do is I draw sometimes. Now, I'm not a very good drawer in artistic sense, but it's a great way for me to visually express what I'm trying to get out of myself, like on paper, and then I see it in a very, very different way. So drawing is probably, and sometimes I write poetry, not very often, but they would be two expressions in terms of artistry that help me a lot.
Yeah, and I think that's great that sometimes you just sit down and draw and let out your emotions. And I think it's important for people to do that because life can sometimes be so stressful. And sometimes you just need to sit down and instead of just, writing about what you're feeling or talking with someone, for some people, like you, drawing works better or writing
Yeah,
music or doing whatever they love. So I think it's important that we do that on a day-to-day basis or at least once a week. Just sit down and let out your emotions.
absolutely.
And I see writing as an art form. So was writing your book a way to express yourself?
Not really. And what I mean by that is, it might sound like an unusual answer because most people would assume that it would be. Simply because the fact is, I struggle with actually writing. So dyslexia, one of the challenges with it is writing, spelling, grammar, etc. So I find it very, although my wife would firmly disagree, I think I've got amongst many other mental blocks, I've got one around writing because I'm so scarred from school about being constantly like red marks and X's and minus F and whatever, and work being kind of almost thrown back at me and sometimes literally thrown back at me. So I've got this I don't know, anxiety about writing and expressing myself. And I'm very good when it comes to like somebody sitting down and literally typing what I'm saying. So I'm much better expressing myself verbally. Hence the reason I tend to, speak more, go on video more, things like that. At the same time, I think there's an intimacy with a pen that cannot be created with a lens, like being, in other words, a video or a microphone for that matter. So, excuse me, one of my wishes is to actually lean more into writing as a way to express myself in the world because it's a very intimate process.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. And you support leaders and entrepreneurs to lead better lives. So are there any creative or unique things you do to help them lead better lives?
Yeah, I mean, on many of the retreats and experiences I run around the world, from an artistic standpoint, I'm often, people make fun of me, go, oh God, you're not going to get us to draw again, but I will give them an exercise and sometimes that requires them to draw. And then to, I suppose, process or analyze the drawing maybe with a unique perspective, like to step back to help me support them analyze it in a way that perhaps they can't do themselves. So I would use drawing a lot. On occasion, I have been known to also ask people to have the experience. We help people begin to visualize the future, and one of the ways we do that is to get them to draw or paint a full canvas painting of the life they want, not the things they want, but the person they want to be in 3 to 5 years from now. We get them to paint that, and it's a very, very unique process.
Wow, that's awesome. And I love how you're talking about, to take a step back and look from a unique perspective. And I think one cool thing about art and like especially visual art is if you were to put out like a canvas with a painting and got multiple people to look at it, they would all have different interpretations of the painting based on their experiences and what they've been through and what they've seen. It'll look different to them. They interpret it. Maybe someone will see like a person coloring or someone else will see a musician playing. So I think that's one really cool thing about art where it can be interpreted in many different ways.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And, even in like poems and stuff, I remember in school, we would read poems and everyone would have a different kind of sense on what the meaning of the poem was or what the artist was trying to say, which was really cool.
Yeah, really. I love that.
And do you think that people expressing themselves and letting out their emotions every now and then can help better their life? And if so, how?
Yeah, except I don't like the every now and then because it feels somewhat controlled, or it invites people to do it every now and then. I think we should do it often. I think we should do it daily. And I think we should not pick our moments to allow our emotion out because that's all about control. So I think we should be allowed in society to express who we are at the core, but also we should surround ourselves with people who appreciate us allowing ourselves to be expressed And we should find friendships that allow that as well. I think there's a lot of control, and there's a lot of, so for example, there's one thing I often notice in a lot of the work I do, we dig deep into people's lives if they are willing to go there. In other words, they dig essentially deep into their lives to begin to understand who they are at the core and begin to imagine the lives they can live. And one of the things that often happens is people cry. Emotion comes up, and one of the ways we see that in people is it's the tears are often an expression or an extension of a state that they're in, and it means often that they're tapping into something that's important to them. But they often apologize for those tears. They go, "I'm sorry," and or somebody picks up a Kleenex and runs to them to be the hero. But in actual fact, really what they're trying to do is to mop up the tears because they are uncomfortable with this emotion being expressed in the room, because they probably grew up not being allowed to be emotional themselves. So I think and believe, even though as a parent I struggle with this sometimes myself, but I think we should be allowed to express ourselves more often in society.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And I think sometimes society can hold you back. You may think, oh, they may not like my song because it's different, or they may not like my new painting because it's different. But you should just, put it out there. And there's going to be people that'll be negative, but you just got to push them away and listen to the positive feedback.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when people share their one last talk, is creativity a part of their story?
No. And what I mean by that is in my mind, creativity is the how. It is the where the intellect begins to take over and begins to create a framework, particularly in a one last talk. I think the artistry is their truth. The artistry is the essence of their story. I think creativity we've got to be careful with when it comes to our story, because when we do a one last talk event and when we put these on in different parts of the world, or when people step onto that stage, we've got to be careful that they don't over create it to make it look good or to control the emotion or to fill in the blank. So yes, there's a creative element to it, but what I try to do is to not over architect that, not to give them too much time to over create. So essentially get them in front of their truth, create a bit of a frame around it, which is the creativity, and then express that as openly as possible. We have found consistently the people that put too much creation and creativity into their one last talks, they become sterile. They become almost slightly mundane, slightly robotic in the way they deliver their talks. When the people who have very, very little time to prep or choose not to over prep, they're the rawest, the most beautiful, the cleanest, the purest expression of that person, and it connects more with the audience as a result, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. No, I totally see that. When you're more like truthful and you act more as a human being instead of, like, as you're saying, like a robot who's rehearsed their speech 1,000 times. When you just say what you want to say and you connect with the audience, it's just much better overall.
100%.
And art can be therapeutic and it can help people through difficult situations. So has art ever helped you through a difficult situation? And can you give an example?
Yeah. I mean, I think writing sometimes has helped me. I think reading poetry, I think drawing. I mean, in school, I think, it allowed me to get through. I mean, school was a very painful process period for me for a number of reasons, primarily one being a learning disability that the school just didn't see or recognize or know, including myself. So I don't blame the system. It's just, it is what it is. But I think there was ways that I creatively checked out, whether it was dreaming or writing or poetry or story, things like that. I think telling stories, sharing stories, creating stories. I mean, it's an age-old tradition worldwide, particularly in Ireland, where I'm from. Sitting around telling stories is a beautiful way to almost forget the pain that you're in to some extent. So yeah, there'll be various forms of art that I have leveraged, whether it was consciously or otherwise. Music has helped me tremendously in my life. So yeah, absolutely, art has played a part.
Yeah, that's awesome. And are you attracted to any particular artist?
Not really. I mean, there's a poet called David White who I'm a big. I don't like the word fan, but I have a lot of respect for him and his work and the way in which he writes. he would probably be the number one artist in the world that I would appreciate more than anybody else. And I'm not attracted to one particular, painter or musician really at all. But David White's poetry is beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm the same. Like, I can't choose one artist or one musician. I like all of them. I can't really choose one person.
Absolutely.
And are you attracted to one particular art form?
I would say poetry would probably come up here again. I think that's probably the art form that I'm drawn to more than anything else. I think it's probably one of the most difficult forms of art, where in many respects most poetry is quite distilled, and you've got to capture a lot in so few words. And a poem is, I actually think David White, who I've referenced, said something like, great poetry disarms you, or he said it way more poetically, excuse the pun, but it's some variation of that. And I think great poetry just penetrates you. It just gets right into who you are and into your heart. And it can also introduce you to yourself in a way as well. I think that's what great poetry does.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And I also think poetry, like I said, it can have different meanings to different people, and they can interpret it so many different ways. And I think that's the really cool thing about it as well.
Absolutely. And then we can the lovely thing I also love about poetry is that you can read it today and interpret it in a particular way, you as an individual. Forget about even different people, and then I can read the same poem in a year from now and see it in a very, very different light based on who I am or who I've become or who I'm trying to become in that period of time. And you can read a poem 100 times, and the 101 time you read it, it just hits you. It's such a different place, and can just blow you open.
Yeah, I totally agree. And my heartification project is all about giving back to the community. So how do you give back to the community?
Yeah, so I suppose within our own community, our Brave Clan, as we call it, we do quite a bit of things like videos and Q&As and live stuff and whatever. Not secretly, privately, I suppose I would also help people who are struggling with coaching or mentoring and stuff like that. And we'll also help people to get onto our programs that maybe are struggling to do so. We also built an orphanage in Peru, going back, I suppose, 5 years ago. 4 years ago, we finished that project. So we raised some money, and myself and my wife, we built a bakery. We run give and grow trips to different parts of the world. That's kind of the main stuff that we do. And yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. And how would you like people to get in touch with you?
I suppose philipmckernan.com is probably the simplest, easiest way to get a sense of our work or follow along if people are so inclined.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Remember, if you want to find out more about this guest, please go to my show notes where I have all the links needed. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to my podcast series and help me by sharing it, leaving a rating, and a comment. I hope you join me on my next podcast. Bye for now.